This was an audience from the political and diplomatic strata of Europe, as well as trade unions and think tanks. They had gathered at Lancaster House in London for one of a series of discussions on the way forward for social policy in Europe. Britain's Europe ministers set the background of social justice in Europe, and particularly Britain.
The concept of social justice was created and nurtured in the European continent, and we have been clear and remain very clear that Europe is much more than just a market. Europe is the only continent where almost 500 million people have access to an effective state healthcare system, where for most the cost of school education is the tax contribution, and where the elderly can, in most countries, have a dignified old age through the provision of state pensions. And in the UK, we are, I would argue, an important part of that mainstream progressive tradition. And I would argue in today's climate that the Labour government remains a central part of that tradition. We have established, of course, and we celebrate the establishment nearly a decade ago, of the national minimum wage. Even today, the fourth highest minimum wage in the European Union of the 27 countries. Europe used the UK anti-discrimination legislation as a model for wider work. The only European country with a better record in health and safety is Sweden. And in the UK, 30% of the UK workforce are members of our trade unions, compared to 27% in Germany or 9% in France. And while, of course, we'd like to see that 30% even higher, it is a cause for reflection that we have that degree of membership here in the UK. And against all of this backdrop, we have 10% higher employment rates above the EU average, with 2.5 million jobs created in the past decade alone.
The minister asked his audience to consider that old European models, which included protectionism, were designed for an era which had disappeared. That was a time when Europe had few rivals. It was now important to get people into different forms of work.
It's time to reflect on whether that old caricatured idea of a social Europe of short-term protectionism and supposed interference from Brussels is in any way any longer relevant. The focus, I believe, has shifted from trying to protect jobs to protecting and supporting the individual. Now, we all have, I think all of us, as individuals, regardless of our perspective, we all have the instinct to protect, and most of us have the instinct to be progressive. So what we have to discover, I believe, and articulate, is a progressive protectionist instinct, which is one which ensures individuals can succeed in the first ever genuinely global labour market.
Environmental jobs would now be a necessary priority, with perhaps 1 million employed in this sector in 40 years' time. But there was also the challenge of population movement.
The United Nations has estimated that there are at least 185 million people worldwide now living outside their countries of birth. 185 million people, more than double the number just 3 decades ago. So that changing face of European towns and European cities creates its own challenges. As we all know, social pressures, economic opportunity, but not least also the requirement for tough anti-discrimination policies, not just here in the UK, but across the entire European Union.
These problems had to be faced to ensure future generations, as individuals, were given the opportunity to fulfil their aspirations. And the minister gave this warning.
The danger will be that in possibly the most prosperous, dynamic and successful continent on the earth, that the next generation of Europeans run the danger of being less well off than their parents, which is the first time I think that can be said, at least for 2 or perhaps 3 generations, based on some of the trends that currently exist.
And there was also a warning from others that social policy will have to take more of the European budget if it's to tackle future problems.